Thank you for talking with me on your Ambedkar book, Sashi. Um,
It's a
my,
pleasure. Thank you for doing it yourself, Meena.
um, my first question is, I was wondering where to start, and I wanted to share my experience of first reading Ambedkar, my first experience of reading you, and I wanted to ask you, when did you first read Ambedkar? But before that, when I first read Ambedkar, I was 17 or 18, and I just wanted to go and burn the world. It's like, it made me so angry, and it didn't matter which way you looked at it. Whether you looked at it as somebody who comes from a marginalized background, or whether you saw this as, a child of intercaste couples. So it was like literally make me burn. But the first time I read your book, it was from a library copy, and I think it was a great Indian novel. And I was like, this woman writes so fabulously. Because there was Sashi Deshpande and then there was Sashi Tharoor. It was a library book, so there was no photograph of you, So this was somebody who was absolutely charmed only by your prose.
Wonderful. Glad to hear
Yeah,
it.
so what was your first encounter with Dr. Ambedkar?
Well, in some ways, not as anger-making as yours, because by the time I read about Ambedkar, it was the biography by M.L. Sahare, which told you the story of his life. The prose is not the most scintillating, but all the, interesting episodes. And Sahare was somebody who was a contemporary of Ambedkar's. So he knew Ambedkar, and he had witnessed and lived through much of the episodes of the life. So there was enough to make you angry about what Ambedkar went through as a child, but you also had the happier developments thereafter, the achievements, the successes, and so on. So that's when I first read him. Reading stuff by him took a while longer, and what I found when I read him was that I was very impressed with the prose. It's quite different, you read two contemporaries. Nehru was equally prolific, maybe not equally prolific, because Ambedkar, nobody can match Ambedkar in output. But Nehru was pretty prolific for a political leader at that time. But he had this slightly flowery prose. He had this tendency to use some exquisite descriptive language and so on. Ambedkar was much more direct.
He was sharpening the saw all the
That's
time.
right.
Yeah,
he was much more blunt. And I find that when you get on subjects, for example, the annihilation of caste, here's a man who pulls absolutely no punches.
Yeah.
Whereas with Nehru, even when he's writing about people he doesn't like, there's a gentleness to the prose. So there is that difference, I can see.
Okay, so when I was thinking of doing this panel, I was thinking we must feed some headlines as well.
Ayyo, that's not a good sign.
That was my intention. So my question was that, like when you read somebody's biography or you read what they have done, or especially when you start writing on it, as you have done with Dr. Ambedkar, one of the things that really stands out is that he's all of 36 years old and he burns the Manusmriti. He burns the Manusmriti.
Yeah, back in 1927.
In 1920, yeah. So it's the and then there's the Mahad Satyagraha, the Kalaram temple agitation. So do you think the very close reading of Ambedkar has affected your viewpoint of Hinduism?
No, I'm not a great fan of the Manusmriti myself, so that didn't particularly bother me. But what he was trying to do was deliberately to shock. I mean, this was at the time of the Chavda tank agitation, where he, as he said at the time himself, I'm not doing this agitation because Dalits can't find water to drink somewhere, but that we don't accept the right to be denied. I mean, we don't accept to be denied the right to drink water from here. And by the same logic, he wanted to do something that would shock the conscience of the Hindu population. It's very interesting that even to get the ground for the campsite where they actually had the agitation, where the people had to stay and park, they actually had to rent the land from a Muslim gentleman because the caste Hindus in the area were not prepared to, even for the payment of rent, give him land for them to have all their agitators resting overnight for this satyagraha. So Ambedkar felt it was important to jolt the caste Hindus a bit, and 10 years later he was asked in an interview why he did it. And he said, I have nothing to apologize for. It was important to convey the signal that it's essential to essentially reject the fundamental trappings of the Hindu caste system, of which the Manusmriti, he said, is an embodiment. So I don't reject other books of Hinduism. There are many things I like and respect, but Manusmriti stands for things I can't accept, and that's... So he was quite clear about the message he was trying to send with that.
And yeah, and he did that in a very, very bold, very provocative way. But Ambedkar's struggle also involved a temple entry agitation at this time. And I was wondering, as somebody who, your stance on Sabarimala, for instance, would you see yourself influenced by Ambedkar and say, I don't know, lead women into the Sabarimala?
No, look, Sabarimala is a different story, and we can come to that if you like. Ambedkar on temple entry was very interesting. He had two attitudes. One was, obviously, everyone at that point, every enlightened person of every faith, and certainly pretty much everywhere, including in Tiruvankur, where we ended up with a very large number of people supporting the temple entry agitation here. Manatha Padmanabhan led that famous march to Trivandrum. We had people of various castes coming in, and the Diwan of Travancore finally declared temple entry back in 1937. So Ambedkar, to that degree, said yes for temple entry, but he was opposed to making a fetish of entry into temples. His argument was, if they don't want us, how does it matter? There are more important things we can do. So for example, when the Dalit leaders in Bombay had got together to try and plan a fundraising committee to construct a temple to Chokhamela, and they wanted Ambedkar to lead that. Ambedkar went the other way. He said, on the contrary, let's not raise the money and build one more temple. Let's actually raise the money and use it for the uplift or the betterment of Dalits, schools, colleges, universities, that sort of thing. So he had that stance as well. And I think that you can respect the point of both. That those who want to go to temple should have the right to go, but as a priority for the Dalit people, is entering the temples the most important thing, or social economic uplift more important? And there, on this particular issue, he succeeded. He persuaded the others not to go ahead with that particular venture. Now, on Sabarimala, two things should be said. I admired, and I've said this, Ambedkar for being in many ways India's first male feminist, because he was somebody who spoke up for the rights of women way before it was fashionable to do so, and he would do so to both male and female audiences. You should see some of the speeches he made in the 1930s and 40s to women, where he told them, for example, don't let your parents marry you off too early. I will tell your parents they should not press you into marriage. He told them, do not be in a rush to have children. Develop yourself and your own capacities first. In your marriage, you are the equal of your husband. The husband has no right to dictate to you what to do. This sort of talk. And then when he was a member of the Bombay legislature, he legislated for equal wages for women and men laborers. He actually tried to bring in birth control measures to support women, though he was then defeated by the conservatives in the assembly. So in every respect, he was not only a progressive on women's rights, but way ahead of his time. Some of the things he said, I think, would look progressive in the mouth of a politician in the 21st century of India. So there's no question about that. And I admire him for it, I applaud him for it, and I've talked about it in my book as well. Sabarimala, I took a different stand for a reason that we've shared with the people here in previous years, which was not that I deny women the right to go, but that when I first took that stand, I then decided to consult women, particularly Hindu women affected by this whole process. And I was startled to realize that I had got it wrong, because the bulk of the women I spoke to said, no, if we believe in the myth and the legend, then we should not go, and we don't want to go. We'll go when it's appropriate for us to go, because if you go without the faith, then why are you going? And if you have the faith, how can you go? That's what it boiled down to.
You've been talking to the wrong women, Sashi.
I did.
Should have asked me.
But let me add one more thing, Meena. We all know that in religion, there are some rules that are different from civic life and civic society. So if you look, for example, at the Catholic Church, let's take America, where if you create a golf club and you deny women, or you tell women you can be members but you can't be office bearers, the golf club would be closed down by law, because you cannot discriminate against women in America, even on those grounds. But the Catholic Church has rules that women can come in, but they cannot be bishops or cardinals or whatever. They can only be nuns, right? And no one challenges that. No one finds that violative of gender equality. No one finds that, because the assumption is religion has its own rules and practices that are different from what other societies have. And therefore, just as we accept that there are women who would perhaps be willing to join a golf club where they can't be office bearers, but that's illegal, by the same logic, the women are willing to be nuns even though they know they can't become bishops or cardinals, because they have internalized or accepted the logic of the church. Now, this may change. In the Anglican Church in England, for example, a woman can become a bishop. But in the Catholic Church in any country, you can't. So it varies according to them. Similarly, if you want to worship Lord Ayyappa and you're a woman of a certain youthful age, there are 60 temples in Kerala that have no problem admitting you. But in Sabarimala, there is a specific convention and a specific, if you call it a myth or you call it a legend, which adheres only to that place. And in that place, if you are a faithful person, you will not want to violate the sanctity that's provided for there. Now, you may disagree rationally, and maybe a time will come when that will change. But today, that is still the majority sentiment. And because it is the majority sentiment, this is why, since then, no one has tried to permit this to happen.
Okay, I'm not going to go too deeply into this. But I just like to say that we cannot use scale as the determining factor, you know. Earlier, the same idea that if a Dalit person goes into the temple, it becomes defiled. So if you're a believing Dalit, you should not go because your presence can pollute. It's the same argument, you know, whether it's a women's body or whether it's a Dalit's body. The argument is that you are going to pollute the God, so you better stay out. You know what I mean? So Shashi, I don't want to argue with you. I want you to be like Dr. Ambedkar. I want you to lead the change. So
Great, Meena. No, I respect your point of view.
Okay. So
because the truth is that at one level, that is absolutely a syllogism, that it's a question of whether somebody will pollute. But in fact, at another level, I don't think that the Sabarimala people speak of pollution. What they say is that
they threaten his celibacy.
No, the story is, as you know, that
and I believe that when women tried to go, you called it provocative, and I wanted to say, Sashi, if I come and sit on your lap, that is provocative.
Fortunately, you don't seem to weigh very much, so it's okay.
No, so if I just go and say hello to Ayyappa, that's not provocative, you know what I mean? So in what way is that provocative? So
no, we're getting way away from Ambedkar and my book.
No, I'm coming back. No, it's very related to Ambedkar.
One,
no, it's very related to Ambedkar because it's about equality, but it's also about what Ambedkar did in terms of legislation. You know, like in the south, for instance, now we have temple priests from all communities in Tamil Nadu. So, you know, the doors are being open at every stage. But I actually wanted to come to this very interesting thing that because you brought up the issue of women, and Ambedkar is this pioneering feminist, and I wanted to tie up that with something else that you write in your book, which for me was very impressive, which is, I think on page 66, you quoting Ambedkar, the salvation of the depressed classes will come only when the caste Hindu is made to think and is forced to feel that he must alter his ways. I want a revolution in the mentality of the caste Hindus. And I really think that that's very tied up also to the question of women, because how do we keep the caste system alive? We keep it alive by controlling women. So what do you think about this, you know, this revolution in the mentality of caste Hindus? Like, for me, a book like yours is a massive, you know, is a kind of breach because everybody is talking about Ambedkar. He belongs to literally everyone. So it's a first step. But how do you take this forward?
You know, change is a process, and let's face it, it has been evolutionary. It's been 65 years since Ambedkar died, and how much difference has occurred? There can be debate. There's been some progress and there hasn't been some. In fact, towards the later part of my book in Assessing the Legacy, I've quoted an Ambedkarite Dalit scholar who has given a rather unsparing account of all the continued problems that Dalits experience in our country, including violence, sexual violence, and other things that people are still being subject to in many parts of the country, particularly North India. Whereas in the South, for example, we have priests of all communities, including Dalits, a Dalit priest is relatively unknown in the north still. So there's still a lot of changes to come. But I think our objective has to be to push change along as much as we can within the limits of what the traffic will bear, which is what society will swallow, because gradually change does come. I mean, for example, urban discrimination is very much less because of the fact that along with urbanization, a certain anonymity comes. Whereas in a village, everybody knows who everybody is, who's son or daughter of whom and which part of the village they live and what they do. In a city, you have no idea who you're rubbing shoulders with on the bus. You can't start worrying about ritual pollution standards and so on. Similarly, thanks to Ambedkar's affirmative action policies, which have been endorsed and repeated and renewed and prolonged, you will frequently find a person of a so-called higher caste, Gandhiji would prefer to say a different caste, going to an office and taking orders from a Dalit who's his boss. So from all of these things, there will be a certain change in society inevitably, because the structural circumstances have made such change possible.
I like your optimism, but it's like, you know, like in the last week of December, this happened in a Tamil Nadu village in Pudukkottai. They mixed human excrement in the drinking water supplied to the Dalit people, and
Sickening.
and and at this time it was very interesting for me to observe from close quarters, because the Dalit Panthers or the Liberation Panthers, who are constantly anti-police, anti-state, they don't believe very much in, you know, because they believe police also cause atrocities and police also cause terror. They started pushing, saying that you must introduce an investigative panel that prevents atrocities before they happen, like a Q branch or a special police. And I was like, how is policing going to solve the problem? But what is going to make people stop doing atrocities? Do you think if we call an atrocity an act of terror, would it stop? Like, what is it that's going to make people at the village level stop? I don't know, I'm just asking you an open question.
Well, to my mind, mixing human excrement in water is unforgivable. It's a crime. One can find 10 sections of the Indian Penal Code that it's offending, and the people who did
Nobody has been arrested yet, even though it's a very progressive state that I am proud to come from, but you know how it is.
No one's been arrested.
No one has been arrested.
Because they couldn't find a culpable person, or because they're not investigating with any serious?
I think this is somewhere again where Ambedkar comes into view, where Ambedkar says that how do you expect justice when everybody is of the same caste at the police level, at the judiciary level?
The police are not all of the same caste in Tamil Nadu, are they? I don't think
the police there apparently were trying to fix the Dalits and make them take the blame for the mixing of the water. They were trying to lay the blame on the people who were victims themselves. So.
Oh, that's disgusting.
So.
Well, I mean, the problem, of course, in many, many cases of justice is the question of proof. Because you may find an honest policeman saying, I can't take this forward because I will not be able to find proof that will stand up in court.
Evidence.
But to my mind, that's unforgivable. I think most decent people, irrespective of what caste they belong to, will find it a condemnable act. So, I mean, I'd like to think, you know, for example, one of Ambedkar's quarrels with Mahatma Gandhi was precisely about Gandhiji's refusal to condemn the idea of the caste system. But what Gandhiji was arguing was, he felt that caste is not the problem. The problem is if some people allow themselves to think that their caste is superior to another caste. He said, let them all have a sense that they have different castes, which have different roles, but they're not, one is not superior to the next. Now, that argument was his argument. It's not one shared necessarily by everybody, but many Hindus have tended to see, many Hindus who still believe in caste have tended to see it that way. Some of us were brought up in an oblivious to caste environment, which again has a problem, as I understand it, because when I wrote about it in a column, a young Dalit blogger got after me saying that to be oblivious of caste is itself a position of privilege, because no Dalit can afford to be oblivious to caste. So we are all learning and adjusting. So in fact, I've become a little more caste conscious than I was earlier. And certainly after coming into Indian politics, circumstances have forced me to be aware of caste much more than before. But that doesn't mean that Ambedkar's objective that caste should be annihilated should be scattered, should be dropped, because the objective, I think, is a healthy one. Ironically, had this been progressive techniques to give benefits to people on the basis of caste, that has entrenched caste politically all the more in people's consciousness. So there is, you know, Ambedkar and Nehru would actually have been on the same page on annihilating caste. Nehru thought caste was an old-fashioned idea that would disappear. Ambedkar thought it was an evil idea that needed to be eradicated. But both didn't want any caste at all. But the conventional political instrument of mobilization that caste became made caste much more entrenched in the political consciousness.
Actually, I want to muddy the water a little bit, both with your reading of Ambedkar, but also what you say is the obliviousness of caste, because I can understand, you know, the Kerala, where being coming from the background that you come from is landed, is seen as, you know, Savarna, in some ways upper caste, powerful. But the history of the Nayar service society, or things prove that they were oppressed. But also once you move to the North India, you know, and this is where Periyar comes in, and I was like, we have to read Ambedkar, but we also have to read him alongside Periyar, because you know, Periyar often says that the Dalits are not the ones most oppressed by Hinduism because you're outside the fold. So you're what you call Edirmarai, the counter to Hinduism. But it's the Shudra who has to bear all the humiliation of Hinduism. And I think one of your colleagues, DMK MP Raja, says that when somebody says you're a Shudra, it means you're the son of a prostitute. So you're a very proud Hindu. How do you reconcile that with what some people's reading of Hinduism is?
No, you know, Meena, I've written about what I understand by my Hinduism and why there are elements that I'm very proud of. And I stand by those things, which I've done so over 350 pages, so I'm not going to try and summarize it in 2 minutes. But the truth is that the things I admire about Hinduism are, for example, its extraordinary respect for incertitude. It's the fact that it completely leaves open the room for doubt and questioning for everything, every fundamental, including when you think that the creation verse in the Rig Veda says, you know, who made this world, where has it come from, you know, who has done it, only he in the heaven knows, or maybe even he does not know. Maybe even he does not know is in the Rig Veda first few pages, the Nasadiya Sukta verse. So that kind of openness and respect for criticism and challenge created a culture for 1,000 years of tremendous debate, disagreement, and so on. And to my mind, those are very valuable things. The notion that Hinduism doesn't just believe in tolerance, but believes in acceptance, which Swami Vivekananda preached very powerfully in Chicago. What is acceptance and what is tolerance? I thought about this a lot after I first read this as a teenager. Tolerance is what we're all taught in history books is a good thing. A tolerant king is a good guy because he allows other people to practice their own faith and so on. But if you really think about it, the tolerance is a very patronizing idea. A tolerant king is saying, I have the truth, you are in error, but I will generously indulge you in your right to be wrong. That's really what tolerance is. But what Vivekananda says Hinduism is about is not tolerance, but acceptance. And the acceptance comes from the idea, yes, I believe I have the truth. You believe you have the truth. I will respect your truth. Please respect my truth. And that, to my mind, was an extremely good recipe for coexistence in a multi-ethnic, multi-religious society like ours. Now, in the case of the Hinduism that I described, these are some of the essential features. A religion that doesn't claim to be the only true religion, a religion that finds that all ways of reaching out to the divine are equally valid, a religion that accepts people as they are, all of these things. You know, when it comes to the Dalit
philosophy, there's no questioning the philosophy.
That's the philosophy.
Absolutely.
But then when you look, for example,
how did we turn from that into this violence and misogyny?
So those are petty criminal behaviors that I have never shown any admiration or sympathy for. In fact, in my book, I quote a famous anecdote about Adi Shankara when he was walking in Benares with his followers, and a Dalit, or a Chandala, as the word was used in those days, was coming in the opposite direction. And the disciples rather brusquely asked this Dalit to move aside from the great sage's path. But he held his ground, and he said straight to Adi Shankara, why should I move? And what is it you want me to move? Is it my body? But isn't the Atman inside me the same as the Atman inside you? Whereupon Adi Shankara, it is said, fell at the feet of the Dalit and hailed him as his guru, saying, you have understood my teachings far better than some of my disciples have. So that is the spirit of Hinduism that I celebrate. That's the kind of Hinduism that accepts, that respects, that values these qualities. And that's what I was writing about and why I'm a Hindu. But the truth is, thank you, but the truth is that social practices sometimes depart a long way from the essence of the religious philosophy.
Definitely. I'm going to come
And
far away
we
from
don't-
Hinduism. It's been very engaging, and we also have in 15 minutes maybe open up for questions. So one of my questions is that you talk about Ambedkar being a misfit in politics. And I thought it came from a place of lot of deliberation and understanding, and also, you know...
I'm said to be a misfit in politics myself, so it's not an insult.
I didn't want to spell that out, but you know, okay, it came from this idea of comradeship with Ambedkar. Maybe you saw him the way you see yourself, like, what's this guy doing here? But how did you feel writing his story, like, as a politician yourself now? And
Look,
the
I felt a
struggles
lot
that
of
he
admiration
faced.
because of a number of factors.
No, but Shashi, everybody says you win elections. That's not Ambedkar's story, so...
Yeah, he didn't win
his,
too
his
many
hit rate
elections.
is different.
But you know, he had institutional challenges that I don't face. I have other challenges, and but in his case, you know, he was somebody who, frankly, was not too indulgent of other people. He didn't suffer fools gladly. He was a blunt-speaking man. He spoke as he wrote. He was tough on people, and I think that he was somewhat reluctant to compromise on some of the stands he took. And remember, he was running in reserved constituencies in the last elections he lost. And so there would be a Congress-supported Dalit against Ambedkar. And in all those cases, Ambedkar came out second best, in one case third. So that was a tough problem, but that's not what I meant. I'm sorry. The affinity that I was talking about came from a person who was in politics but saw politics principally as a vehicle for ideas. He was a man of incredibly fecund imagination and intellect. He wrote so many books, far more than I will ever write. And what is more, he wrote furiously all the time. So he became the only author I've heard of who published books after his death. From the papers found on his desk, 3 more books came out after he died. That was the kind of productive intellectual energy he had. Similarly, he had tremendous energy in the world beyond politics. He founded 3 colleges, which are amongst the most highly respected colleges today in the area of Aurangabad. He is somebody who started society after society, the Bahishkrit Hitkarni Samaj, for example. He was somebody who was full of a desire to bring about change, but rarely was he able perhaps to see through the institutional and organizational processes that politicians find necessary. So even the political parties he started a party called the Labour Party, Independent Labour Party. He dissolved that. Then he started something called the Scheduled Caste Federation. Then he dissolved that. In his last year of his life, he founded the Republican Party of India. That still continues, but it never became the sort of nationwide refuge that I think he must have hoped it would be for the Dalits as well as other underprivileged sections of society. He was an outstanding parliamentarian. He could speak as well as he wrote. And some of his speeches, I would particularly urge you to Google a speech called the Grammar of Anarchy speech, which is a speech he delivered in November 1949 when they had finished discussing the adoption of the Constitution. What an exceptional mind, such deep well springs of knowledge, of exposure to the world, of reading. So this is a serious man. On top of that, his intellect. He was, as you know, as probably many of you don't know maybe, he was an economist of considerable distinction. His PhD was in economics at Columbia. He was the leading authority on British provincial taxation in India and one of the leading authorities on the British manipulation of the Indian rupee, the problem of the Indian rupee. So he was an authority on economics. He was an authority, in some ways you could argue, a pioneering sociologist. He presented a paper on caste at Columbia University in 1916, which was the first of its kind, tracing the origins and the systems of caste and the iniquities that it imposed upon people. He was a lawyer who had studied law and who had also been admitted, come very close to being admitted to the bar in the UK, and became the first Indian principal of the very prestigious Government Law College in Bombay. So this is somebody who's got outstanding credentials in 3 unrelated fields. And as a lawyer, he became a constitutional authority that absolutely is second to none. And in that spirit, even though he was opposed to the Congress insisted on making him chairman of the drafting committee of the Constitution. Just as earlier Mahatma Gandhi had persuaded the Congress and Nehru had felt the same way, that Ambedkar should be the first law minister in the cabinet formed upon independence in 1947. So here is somebody who had astonishing achievements. Even if he had been born into privilege with 2 silver spoons in his mouth, to achieve all this would have been remarkable. But he was born the 14th child of an army subedar in an army cantonment in Mhau in Maharashtra, where this unfortunate child lost his mother when he was young, was brought up in this home where children were dying, where there were all sorts of problems. Father retired soon after his birth. He achieved everything entirely by the merit of his own mind and his own hard work. And he did so despite all the indignities you can possibly imagine. And I've described some of the most searing incidents in the book that he had to go through. So it's impossible not to admire somebody who rose above all of this to achieve what he did. And that, to my mind, is what I... But the misfit in politics was more about issues of temperament and the fact that, of course, he was swimming against the current. Because as somebody who did not support some of the Congress movements, did not support Mahatma Gandhi, did not support civil disobedience, went and cooperated with the British, testified before the Simon Commission, went to the Round Table Conference, served on the Viceroy's Executive Council. There were very many in the nationalist movement who were prepared to denounce him as a collaborator. So to that degree, he came from a background. In fact, when the Congress governments resigned in protest against the British declaring war on Germany and Japan without consulting them, and Muhammad Ali Jinnah declared a day of deliverance, the shocking thing to many was that Ambedkar supported Jinnah, saying that I wish I had done this before Jinnah because I'm also glad to be free of Congress rule, that sort of thing. So this was the kind of reaction that Ambedkar actually gave us. I can see there are some nationalists getting excited there in the music, but I'm just saying Ambedkar therefore came from a very different political tradition, and that made him more of a misfit as well.
So I just wanted to say something else and possibly open the floor, which is Ambedkar says that if there's a catastrophe that can befall this country or a great calamity, it is Hindu Raj. What are your views on that today?
Yeah, again, in fact, Karan Thapa did a conversation with me, which again you can see on YouTube, which is only about this, about Ambedkar's views on Hindu Raj and Hindu majoritarianism. He was scathing. And in fact, one of the things about Ambedkar that I mentioned, he didn't suffer fools gladly. He also spoke sometimes in very intemperate language. So he said, for example, there might be a better Hindu or a worse Hindu, but a good Hindu there cannot be, and things like that, which is very, very tough kind of talk. And he was scathing about the prospect of Hindu rule or Hindu majority rule. But he also did see, apart from the rough language, he also had some very thoughtful arguments. He pointed out that democracy is not about the tyranny of the majority, that ultimately a political majority is different from a communal majority, and that a communal majority has no business to impose itself upon the others because, and he said there are 2 or 3 reasons. One is that they can blow up the state, which is obviously always a danger. But the other thing he said is that they are staying on as minorities out of the trust they place in you, and you have to be worthy of that trust. So that it is important for the communal majority to recognize that it has to work in cooperation with and be specially attentive to the needs of the minorities. So this approach of Ambedkar's was actually something that was also founded in very sensible democratic theory, as well as his own dislike of Hindu majoritarianism. And he was also, by the way, very, very determined that our system would bring about change through law. He was not a revolutionary. He was bringing about a sort of revolutionary change in our society, or sought to, but through the instrument of the law. And that was something else that was very unusual about him. For example, in that famous Grammar of Anarchy speech, he said that he would be opposed to dharnas and hartals and satyagrahas and so on. So they were okay against a foreign ruler. But now that we have created a democratic constitution, we should only use the provisions of democracy and the rule of law to bring about change. Now, this is not always a popular position, including with some Dalits, but he was very clear in his mind about some of these things. And on this issue, I might add, I think he was actually right. Many of you know that when I first came into politics 14 years ago, I refused to support any hartal, even if my own party called one. And I was very pleased when yesterday I saw that the KPCC president announcing that as long as he's president, Congress will never support any hartals. So change comes. It takes time, but eventually wisdom will dawn on everyone.
Thanks for the answer. No, I think some of Ambedkar's thoughts can, be extricated out of the context. It's not just about Hindu-Muslim. Like when he talks about communal majority, the need for a political majority as opposed to the numbers majority, you can apply it to anywhere, like even Sri Lanka, for instance. The first wave of independence strike started when they just killed one laborer, when the British, and then it was an entire anti-British sentiment. But then somewhere the country loses itself. So obviously, he's a great thinker. I recommend all of you to buy this book and read this. Not that Tharoor needs my recommendation.